Good afternoon. Welcome to the Family Forum for students who receive supports through a 504 or IEP plan. We're glad you could join us today. Before we get started, just a couple of pieces of information. The chat and the questions are open for you. They won't be published publicly. We will be able to respond to some questions during the forum, but we may not get a chance to respond to all questions posted in the chat during this time. So for those that we can't respond to during the forum, we'll be following up with them either in the communication that comes out following this forum or in an additional forum we're planning for August. Also, this presentation is being recorded, and so we will have that available to you sometime next week, along with other resources that will be developed based upon the questions that we received. Next slide, please. So you'll have several presenters across the time today. I'm Heather Edlin, the Executive Director for Teaching and Learning, and as our presenters speak today, they will share their name and a little bit about them as well. Can you go to the next slide? These are our other presenters, mostly district staff, but also some community partners with us today. Next slide. So a little bit about the feedback that we received. As you saw in the questionnaire that came out, we asked families and students if they could respond to us with any questions that they had prior to this event. So we did receive 74 questions, comments, or responses to that survey. You can see in this slide the information regarding each of those. The smallest number of individual questions came regarding compensatory education. The largest was individual questions. So we've developed themes for today's presentation that are based around those questions. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about some of those themes. So the plans for 2020, what's happening this fall, curriculum and instruction resources, some general questions about IEP and 504 plan supports, extended school year, support for behavior and social emotional needs, and then what's going to happen in terms of ongoing communication. So next slide. So just to get us started, there were a number of questions that came forward about what's going to happen in the fall. And so I wanted to really be able to speak transparently about where we're at with that right now and what Bellevue School District is doing in response to plans for the fall. So we're expecting more guidance to be coming out from the state this coming Monday, June 8th, but we're not waiting just for that guidance to start planning about what we're going to be doing. There are 4 scenarios that the district is planning for in this time right now. The first one is remote learning 2.0. What does it look like if we need to continue full remote instruction in the fall? So in that one, again, looking at a more robust schedule, how do we ensure that students have a 7-period day or all of more instructional minutes that would be coming forward? So that's the first scenario. The second one would be a re-entry planning, where we're starting to put some instructional pieces in place with students in person in school buildings. And trying to plan for a lot of flexibility in that one, where families who wish to continue to keep their children home have an option to do so. Students who may be immune compromised, other needs, we have remote options for them. But for students and families who need and would benefit from services in person, if we're able to from the state, what would that look like? The next one is around a physical distancing. What does it look like if we are able to return to the buildings, knowing that it's unlikely we'll be able to be in proximity in our lunchrooms, in our recesses, in our classrooms as we were before? How do we ensure that we're able to meet the safety requirements we need to keep our students and our staff safe in those buildings? And then what do we do and how do we plan for what some are projecting will be a COVID-19 resurgence sometime in the fall? And so would that be calendar shifts? Would that be transitioning back to the remote learning 2.0 for everyone? And all of those things will be guided by the progression of COVID and the guidance that we get from the Department of Health and OSPI. So at this time, we don't know exactly what that will look like. Like I mentioned before, we are planning a remote learning 2.0 with various different kinds of stages. We will get more guidance on that from the state on June 8th. And based around that, next slide, please. Based around these 4 different teams, we are entering into some next steps. So those 4 teams that we talked about, they've grounded some scenarios in equity And then they shared those with the cabinet and our school board. And so if you'd like for more information about that, that's available on the school board docs. And so we're entering into this phase right here that's kind of in the parentheses that you see on the side here. One being sharing that with our bargaining units and what does that look like. And the second piece, expanding that design work into include family, students, and staff and other stakeholders. So ensuring we're getting community input into what those 4 scenarios look like. And so your voice as parents of students with IEPs and 504 plans will be critical so that we can understand how you feel about those needs and the various different perspectives that you might have, so we can address the needs of students that are both going to maintain remote learning as well as those who may benefit from more in-person supports. Once we have those designs in place, we'll be continuing to get down into the weeds about the details with each of those, and then we'll continue to align them to guidance we get from federal, state, and local organizations, such as the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction and the Department of Health. So that's our plans for next year. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Wong-Callisto, who's going to talk a little bit about curriculum and instruction and resources for our BSD families.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Kristen Wong-Callisto. I am a elementary director of special education. I support half of the elementary school. This is also my first year in Bellevue School District, so you might not be familiar yet with who I am. So next slide. There have been 4 previous wellness forums. Later on in the resources, you'll see links to all of the previous forums. If you're interested in, you can either watch the recording and you can also access the PowerPoint from those various presentations. There was a wellness forum for elementary families, a wellness forum for middle school and high school, and then there also was a wellness forum for Spanish-speaking families, and finally a wellness forum for Mandarin-speaking families. Now, one of the things that they went over in the forum is how to access resources. And as you might be familiar, there's lots of different resources that Bellevue has around this supporting online and remote learning, access and to support for around social emotional learning, for example, and it's kind of tricky to find all of them. And in each of the forums, you'll see that they actually were able to take the time to navigate to help you find all of those different resources. We'll also be working on producing click sheets to help you more easily direct yourself to the available resources. But just wanted to let you know that that is out there. The other thing I wanted to point out is that in the weekly lesson that we produce in the OneNote for reading, math, and for social emotional learning, the special education department has been partnering with teaching and learning and providing built-in, whether it's alternative text, accommodations, etc. If you look, there should be a little icon that you can click, and that will allow you to access some of those universal design for learning inputs that we've been partnering with teaching and learning on. So next slide. Speaking about accommodations, we got several of you who are indicating that you had questions around accommodations. And as this forum addresses 2 different sort of subsets of how students receive support from us, we have 504 plans and IEP plans. And for the most part, how you can get more information specifically about either your or your student accommodation. If you have a 504 plan, we recommend that you start with your school counselor. Those are the case managers for those plans. And then if you need to escalate your concern, you can do so accordingly. In contrast, for IEP plans, we recommend that your first point of contact be the case manager. Usually that's a special education teacher, but occasionally it might also be another service provider, a therapist, such as a speech language pathologist. Similarly, if you need to escalate your concerns or request for information, you can follow the pathway as outlined below in the slide. So, next slide. Another area that we received a lot of questions around accommodations included accommodations specifically for the ACT, AP, PSATs, SATs. And the first question that I'll answer about this is there's a wondering of why there's a separate request process for accommodation for these various different testing. And the reason is because the ACT and the College Board are actually separate organizations and entities. And so they have their own sort of inherent processes to request accommodation. So in order for you to get accommodations on, let's say, an ACT, AP, or SAT test, you'll want to begin by contacting your school counselor, as there is a sort of independent process for which you have to document your need for accommodation, submit a request for accommodation, and then either the ACT or the College Board then gives the school and or the student notification that their request for accommodation has been granted. The one thing you also want to be aware of is because this is an external process that is done with the respective different organizations, it takes some time. So you'll want to plan, the College Board, for example, recommends you'll want to plan 7 weeks out from when you plan on taking a test to make sure that you've got your accommodations in place. Another thing is that some students don't always want to use accommodation. So for example, for the SATs, they may try taking the assessment without accommodation. And then when they do a retake, then they might want to do accommodation. That's another reason why accommodations aren't automatically applied, is because different individuals choose to take advantage of their accommodation differently. I also put in this slide, you'll see this slide will be published, and so there's links to each of the respective websites so you can get further information specifically about how to get accommodation for the individual test that you might be interested in getting that information about. Okay, so next slide. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about technology. So the first thing I want to address is that we know that for some of you, you may be encountering some actual technical challenges. The help desk is still available and can be accessed at Sammamish High School. And there's other resources for you if you continue to have challenges with accessing Wi-Fi. We have Hotspot. If you run into you or your student run into issues with your laptops, we can provide support there. Another lane of questions that we've received concerns about are the length of screen time, particularly for those of our students who are younger. And so we want to remind people, you'll see a grid on the bottom of this slide. This is OSPI's recommendation for max guidance. And each of these, you'll notice that the amount of time increases as the student gets older, because we don't necessarily want, say, a preschooler spending 3 hours on schoolwork and on their computer. So we just wanted to remind people that we're well aware of your concerns around screen time, and accordingly, there are recommendations that are developmentally matched to make sure that your students are getting the right amount of learning and the right amount of screen time. Now, specifically for this particular audience, we want to make sure that people also know that you can explore some of your students' technology has built-in accessibility features. So some of the common ones might be immersive reader. So if you're using OneNote, you can actually have the text read to your student. It can be translated into a different language. If your child wants to dictate as opposed to typing or writing, that's another feature that is available to you through Microsoft. Even doing something like we're doing this live event through Teams, your child may be receiving instruction via Teams. They can do things like turn on the captioning or mute the background so it's not as visually distracting. So just wanted to flag for you that already built into your student or your laptop, there's lots of different built-in accessibility features. The other thing that we want our families of students with disabilities to know is we have an assistive technology team, and they are also available to provide support. One of the things that you might notice in some of the student OneNote is they've actually created a resource called Accessibility Tools for All. and they go over and has embedded links on how to do things like use immersive reader or use dictate. So built into a lot of the resources your student or you have access to are information about how to increase the accommodations and accessibility for you or your child. Next slide. Now we're about to pivot. There's quite a bit of content that we're going over in this particular presentation. As Heather outlined, we got a wide range of questions. And so as we prepare to go over some of the specific questions around 504 and IEP plan, we wanted to outline for you how we're making decisions as a district. And the first thing that we have to consider is safety. We're in this situation because we are in a public health crisis, and so it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we are following any state proclamations and public health guidelines to ensure the safety of our students and our staff members. So that's going to be the first thing that we're taking into consideration when we have to make decisions. The second is compassion. One of the things that this pandemic and the situation has brought to light is just how diverse everyone's situation is. And so we're trying to partner compassionately and collaboratively with our respective families to make sure that we respect your individual circumstance, because what might be what you and your family need is the exact opposite of what a different what would work for a different family. So that is one of the challenges and the considerations that we have to take into account when we're making decisions as a district, is the unique nature of each of our families. And then finally, common sense. So we're in unprecedented times, as you might have heard over and over and over again. And we're kind of at the edge of where precedent or process or law describe for us. And so that's when we have to rely on common sense. What makes the most sense, where we're kind of having to invent a new process, a new procedure, or a new way of doing things. And we need to make sure that we're doing that with equity and inclusion in mind. So that's some of the considerations that we take into account when we're making decisions. Next slide. Finally, the other thing is that the nature of working with students with disabilities is that there's lots of different governing authorities. So there's the U.S. Department of Ed, which would oversee federal laws such as the Civil Rights, Americans with Disabilities Act, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, or IDEA. And then there's also the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, or OSPI. So some of the things that we are deciding are actually being decided for us by higher governing bodies. So we just want to make sure you were aware that there's a lot that goes into the work of supporting students with disabilities, and there's lots of people and stakeholders who have a say. So I'm going to hand it over to Kelly Clevenger, who will talk a little bit about general questions about 504 and IEP plans.
Good afternoon. So my name is Kelly Clevenger, and I am one of the elementary directors of special education. And I've been working in the district. This is the end of my 7th year or 6th year, can't remember. But I've been here for a while. And I was a teacher for 27 years in teaching special education, and then decided to see if I could help in a broader sense. So I'm really happy to be here this afternoon, and I'm going to be talking to you about some aspects of the 504 and IEP plans that you had some questions about. So could I have the next slide, please? So I realized when we were reading this, so this is I'm sure all of you received, hopefully that you all received a continuous learning plan for your student. And a continuous learning plan was something that OSPI asked all districts to put together for their students so that families could be informed and there could be a plan for how the learning was going to be rolled out during this remote learning time. So the continuous learning plan does not replace your student's IEP, but is a representative of the supports and services while BSD are offering remote learning. You should have received information on this continuous learning plan by mid-May from your student's case manager. This continuous learning plan does not replace the student's IEP. The IEP stays as whole as it was when it was developed, and we will be anxiously waiting to return to be able to live out all those services in the IEP once we are back to meeting in person. Next slide, please. So do students, what about students with 504 plans? Do they have a continuous learning plan? So they don't. Students with a 504 plan did not receive continuous learning plans. To the extent possible, your student's 504 plan should continue to be implemented with appropriate accommodations offered as needed to support their remote learning. And 504 plans process remains the same, an annual review. And if it's not working, then we need to come back to the table and talk a little bit more about the accommodations. So you could reach out to the counselor at the school, who is the person who heads up working on 504 plans. If things are not working and you want to include or talk about different accommodations in this remote learning time. Next slide, please. So another question that came up is, how is progress being measured for students with disabilities, grades and progress reports? So for non-credit bearing courses in K-8, students will receive either marked progressing or non-progressing in areas on the report card. For credit bearing courses in 8th through 12th grade, they will either be marked as an A for grade or an incomplete grade, and then they'll have an opportunity to do some makeup to make up that incomplete. Progress towards IEP goals may not be sufficient to meet IEP goals. So if we have progress reporting, they will not necessarily, if it says they're progressing, that doesn't always mean that they're going to be meeting those goals, because we're in a different kind of remote learning and we haven't been able to work on every single IEP goal. OSPI gave us very strong guidance about grades, and it follows along with our thinking about social emotional issues and things like that, we want to make sure that we're doing no harm and that students aren't penalized because we're in this remote learning session. So we followed our guidance through that. Now, baseline data, when we're done with the IEP, when we're done with remote learning and we're back in the building, we're going to be able to take some baseline data to begin looking at the IEP and deciding whether or not we need to do an amendment to the IEP because maybe they've gone really far ahead on their IEP goals, maybe they've regressed a little bit, and so we would need to come together as a team and decide how we are going to collect data, and then also how are we going to amend the IEP. Next slide. Each team, well, so how will baseline data be collected when we return to buildings? So each team will determine the key data points to be collected, guided, of course, by IEP goals. The IEP team will then look together to adjust the IEP as needed. And then any kind of general ed data collection that is happening in the general ed classroom, if it's appropriate, would also happen for your child as well, your student as well. So we will be able to collect that data when we return to the buildings. Next slide. So this is a really great question talking about transition supports for students moving between grades. So we have a very comprehensive plan for students who are transitioning to a new level of school. For example, preschool to kindergarten, 5th to 6th grade, 8th to 9th, 12th to any student moving on to our transition program. So we have a guiding document that we've been working with as a whole district, and this will include any child that's transitioning, and then specifically we have a team working together for all of our students who are transitioning levels that are specifically students who have 504s and IEPs, and sending and receiving teams are meeting to discuss unique needs and work on tentative schedules. So we actually have point people assigned to each level, and everybody is working through making sure the transition plans and the meetings that need to happen are happening before we end school on June 19th. I think that's my last slide, actually, and I might be passing it on to Karen.
Good afternoon. My name is Karen DeYoung, and I'm one of the 4 special ed directors. And I work with the comprehensive high school secondary teams and ESA staff. So I'm going to talk to you about extended school year and share some information in regard to the eligibility for extended school year and answer some questions that you posed regarding services. Next slide. Okay, extended school year. Extended school year is the provision of special education services beyond the normal school year, and it's in accordance with the student's IEP. So ESY services are for the maintenance of skills. It is required when the student shows regression and then takes 30 days or more to recoup the skill that they had before the vacation time or the break from the school setting. In addition, if a student's at a critical stage of learning, we look at the documented evidence that shows that they're making growth, and without that service or that interruption in service, that they would be at risk of losing that skill. So the need for ESY, or extended school year, is examined case by case for each individual student at the student's annual IEP. The purpose, again, for ESY is for maintenance of student learning skills or behavior. And again, we look at the regression or recruitment of the skills based upon student data. Next slide. Okay. There is a question based upon the ESY and compensatory education. And there's a big difference in the two. Extended school year, again, is services that extend beyond the normal school year. And again, it's in accordance with the student's IEP. The purpose, again, is to maintain the skills that the student has made to date. Our state is awaiting more federal guidance on requirements that are going to be identifying and providing compensatory services due to school closure. But at this time, we're going to wait for that guidance before we can make any informed decisions regarding what compensatory education will look like based on the full impact, as that remains unknown to this date. So if you look at ESY in the blue, it is the provision of services that go beyond the year, the school year, and it's typically, again, because of the absence from the school setting, and it typically looks at least a 30-day school day period of time in which we would like to make sure that the student has recouped their skills. Compensatory skills, in contrast, are to enable the student to make progress. Extended school years is to maintain progress, and compensatory is to enable the student to make progress. So compensatory services are determined after the normal school operations resume, and the IEP team can take baseline data. They can then compare that baseline data to the skills and the present levels that the student demonstrated before closure. Next slide. So then what is the difference between extended school year and summer school? We have both extended school year and summer school. And while ESY is not summer school, students that do qualify for extended school year can also qualify for summer school. If you look, we did talk about what extended school year meant, and on the far right in yellow is the summer school offerings. And there was a question about why all grade levels were not being offered summer school this year. The summer school programs for elementary and middle school students is by invitation only, and it focuses on supporting students in reaching grade level standards in literacy for grade 3 and math in grade 5. And then the focus of remote high school summer school is to ensure that the class of 2020 seniors can meet their graduation requirements and graduate, that high school students are supported with the completion of their semester 2 courses, and that high school students are supported in their credit recovery. And we did include a website address down below if you would like more information regarding that. So next slide. Okay, so I'm going to now turn the slide deck over to Carrie Lang, who will then be addressing remote learning. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Karen said, my name is Carrie Lang, and I'm one of the directors of special education. Main part of my focus is health services, but I also support many other programs in our district. I've been in this role now for 3 years. Prior to that, I worked as a nurse in the hospitals and also in the schools, so it's really my pleasure to be able to support students and families now in Bellevue School District, especially during this time when we're having the coronavirus pandemic, which has been affecting everyone. I'm going to be talking a little bit about remote learning and answering some of the questions that you had about it. Next slide. So the question is, how will BSD assess and address student regression and learning gaps? And you know, we know that many of our students are struggling, and they are not making a lot of progress towards, or amount of progress that we can see anyway, towards their IEP goals. We've been getting feedback from parents and also from our teachers and educators who've been working with students during the school building closures. Going forward for next year, per OSPI, IEP teams, and I believe that Kelly spoke to this a little bit earlier, but our IEP teams will be meeting when the buildings open to get input from parents and educators about what the students' levels of performance were that they saw during school building closures and indeed in the fall, and working together with the IEP team to modify the IEP if needed and make any changes to the services that students might need. These meetings we're going to be having, we're going to be planning them to be on a staggered basis when we come back to school. Next slide. Question is, how is BSD planning for distance learning in the future when some students did not do well with the current model? As Heather mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we are taking a look at what Remote Learning 2.0 might look like as one of the scenarios that we're considering for the fall. And having to do that balance between safety, compassion, and common sense. The guidance that OSPI has given us when the school buildings are closed is that there's no one right way to provide special education services, and that special education and related services can be provided virtually, online, or telephonically. So we are going to be working to see if we can figure out what the best way it is to reach students while making sure that we're keeping students and staff safe if we have to continue with remote learning. Next slide. Is it possible to have in-person classes with smaller groups, 2 to 4 students, at least 1 or 2 days a week? Right now, the governor has closed all in-person education. So there are no options for classes with smaller groups of students to provide instruction. We are going to continue to look at what the guidance and orders are from the governor, from public health officials, and from the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And working to figure out what we want to do going forward to be able to balance that safety, compassion, and common sense to meet the needs for our students. Next slide. Are there options for paraeducators to come to the home to help with instruction? That is a good question, but unfortunately right now we don't have any options for paraeducators to go into the homes. We're really working on making sure that staff and student safety and the safety of the loved ones of our staff members and our students is the #1 priority. We have people who are at high risk from severe consequences if they do contract the coronavirus, and we want to make sure that we're protecting the health and safety of everyone in our learning community while the coronavirus pandemic is requiring that we do learning remotely right now. So again, in watching what OSPI, the governor, and public health officials are telling us, we will continue to look at and revisit our options going forward. Next slide. I'm going to be passing over to Melissa Schweitzer, who is another Director of Special Ed.
Good afternoon, families. Again, my name is Melissa Schweitzer, and I am the director that works with middle schools, choice schools, and the transition program at Interlake. And, you know, there's a lot of information being given to you right now, and we recognize that everyone is experiencing and processing our current state in different ways. We know the unique challenges that come with having a child with special needs, both for the adults and for the children. And we want to take a few minutes to acknowledge the importance of that social emotional health, both for you and for your children. Next slide. This may look familiar to some of you. We know that emotions and intellect, are intertwined, and that emotions drive learning, decision-making, creativity, relationships, and health. Ruler is an approach to social emotional intelligence that we've been using that comes to us from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. So your kids are very familiar with this, and so are your teachers, and you may be as well. Ruler is an acronym that stands for recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating emotions. You may have seen that movie Inside Out, which is a great child-friendly example of how we experience emotions. I highly recommend seeing it. It's one I can see multiple times. You'll notice the mood meter on the right-hand side, which is one of the tools we use to identify and label feelings. We use levels of energy and pleasantness, as you can see on the X and Y axis, and we plot ourselves on that grid. We also practice how to move in and out of quadrants, and recognizing that at any given time we could be feeling fear, anxiety, anger, helplessness, pessimism, optimism, hope, joy, and anything in between. At any given time we can experience any range of those emotions, and there are a range within each emotion, which is why you see the different levels in there. It's important to note that emotions are not positive or negative, but that we learn how to manage what we're feeling as we move through experiences. Next slide. So here we have some examples of how to move through emotions and shift through different moods. You may have tried some of these things, and some may have seemed obvious that you didn't think about trying. So everything from breathing and practicing mindfulness to positive self-talk. Sometimes a distraction is what helps get us in and out of a mood, particularly with different types of disabilities. That can be very helpful if you have a child who isn't yet ready to process through what they're feeling. Accepting, this is how I'm feeling, and that's okay. Physical activity, we know how important that is right now in every different form. And then just appreciating nature and making sure we get outside in safe and healthy ways, of course. Gratitude, even in the most stressful and troubling times, where are those pieces that we can be appreciative and thankful for each other, for what circumstances we do have and how we can approach them. And then my personal favorite, humor. So when things feel stressful and emotionally charged, sometimes the right type of humor can really shift that and help us move into a different layer of emotion. Next slide. So this is a little bit about just healthy habits at home. What are those things that we can do to motivate our child? In schools, we talk about PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports? What are the things that we do proactively to try and set our kids up for success? The most obvious one, although as a parent I was bad about this the first couple weeks, is setting routines. And with that is those expectations at home. We know it's going to look different, and you are the expert on your child. So you need to think through, what can my child manage? What can I manage given the circumstances we are in? Teach, remind, and reward expected behaviors with positive feedback. As a teacher, as an educator, I sometimes forget to do that for my own kids, and reminding them of the things they're doing well. And when they're struggling, to offer them replacement behaviors. Particularly when it comes to online learning options. Being creative. Sometimes this requires reaching out to others, to friends, family. Have you thought about how to handle this? What are you doing about this particular situation? Really thinking outside the box on what can I do to help keep my child engaged. And then maybe the most important, I think when I was thinking about this one, I was thinking about the old saying of, when you're on the plane, you put your mask on yourself first before your child. If you're not taking care of yourself, you can't take care of your children the way you need to. So modeling that behavior and creating those spaces to acknowledge the hardships and the successes. The thing I would say about all of these is really engaging in family conversations. You don't have to figure this out yourself. Kids of all ages with all ranges of needs can talk to us, sometimes with their words and sometimes with their actions. So how do we, sometimes when things are really chaotic and stressful, just sit back for a second and observe, what am I seeing? What do they need? What do I need? And how do we create a plan together as a family that can support that? I am going to pass this on to Christy, who's going to go from YES, who's going to go a little bit deeper with these ideas. Thank you.
Hi, we're just having a little bit of technical difficulty on our end, so I want you to know that the silence that you're hearing right now is us working on getting Christy connected. Christy, are you connected yet? In the meantime, Deb, might you be able to step in for a few of these slides? Deb Kraft?
I certainly can.
Thank you, Deb.
Hi, I'm Deb Kraft, and I'm the Director of Counseling for the district. And I will just say that parenting during the COVID-19 quarantine has both been challenging and probably rewarding. To spend 24/7 with your kids in an unexpected non-vacation-like setting can be very stressful, especially if both parents are trying to work from home and the kids are trying to do their homework and everybody's trying to use the bandwidth in the morning. Other issues parents have run up against is kids just not wanting to get up or saying things like, it doesn't matter, what's the point? If you have questions about that, please call your school counselor, or you can call the mental health line. It rings right to my phone, and the number you'll see coming up a little bit later. Give yourself a break. Nobody's going to be a perfect parent here. So if you have questions or concerns, please give us a call, because in 15 seconds we can talk through things. Often they're not long conversations. Next slide, please. Navigating the unknown. One of the things that kids do not like is not knowing what's going to happen next. In fact, when we in the classrooms, they give them a schedule for the day. When are we going to do math? When are we going to do English? When are we going to do reading? So it's hard for them when they don't know. They don't know what summer's going to be like. Camps have been canceled. Athletics have been canceled. I have a grandchild who was thrilled to find out that she was going to get to have soccer practice with 5 of her teammates starting next week. So I think the best we can do with kids is to give them hope and a positive outlook and say, you know, whatever happens will happen, and we'll deal with it, and we will get help if we need it. And you can call us. We're going to be here. We'll be here all summer. And we'll figure it out. We don't know how school's going to open, but I think Dr. Duran is absolutely committed to giving the kids and families some idea of what's going to happen next, so that they'll know at least what the possibilities are for coming back to school. But it's very stressful for kids, and it's a little bit scary. Additionally, this whole situation that's the civic unrest is unsettling for kids. Next slide, please. There are 5 partners, there are 5 community agencies that we partner with. Youth Eastside Services, which is YES, CMAR, ACRS, which is Asian Counseling and Referral Service, Sound Mental Health, and Consejo. We also partner with the University of Washington Smart Center. They will do individual therapy for us out there, and we work with them to shore up our SEL and counseling curriculum. They do a lot of training for my counselors in different counseling techniques. Next slide, please. So one of the questions is, how do I know if my child has or I have a clinical or a medical concern? Situational depression, situational anxiety can happen when you're in a completely new situation. If this condition affects your ability to function in the world, and it affects your ability to function in the world for more than 6 months, then it becomes a clinical situation. And in which case you might want to give one of those agencies a call, and those numbers are later on in the presentation. Should your student have any suicide ideation, please contact your counselor or call the mental health line, and we will step you through it. I just yesterday had a 7th grader that we talked to, and she went to get a mental health assessment because she just was not seeing any other options. And our job is to expand that window and make kids see that suicide is not the best option ever. So if you have questions about that, again, just give me a call and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I think now I turn it over to Heather. Next slide.
That's correct. Thank you, Deb. Appreciate you taking the time and being able to step in there on those slides for us. So as Deb was saying, taking care of your own needs, and as Melissa was saying as well, taking care of your own needs is also an important piece during this time. And so we also wanted to give you some information, just some other resources that you might find helpful during this time. One of the things that we know is so valuable for parents of students with special needs is having some affinity group, some other parents that they can talk with and chat with and just talk about questions and needs and things like that. And so we wanted to put in some information here about this Bellevue Special Needs PTA. That is a group of other families of students with special needs. They come together, they can answer questions, and it's just a space to share that, as well as stay in the line with advocacy. So if you're someone who really wants to be involved in advocacy, they work closely with me and my team in terms of moving things forward in the school district. So it's a really great support for families, advocacy agency. So just wanted to make sure that people were aware of that. Next slide, please. In addition, we wanted to make sure that people knew, this has come up in the chat a few times this afternoon, make sure you knew how to answer a question that was specific to your student. We know today's information has been more generalized because we were trying to answer a wide scope of questions that came forward. And you may have heard some information today that helped you think a little bit more about something you want to ask your school's team. And so if you're a parent of a student who receives supports through 504 plans, your first point of contact is your school counselor. And then it would go to the building administrator. Following that, it would go to Nikki Morton. You can find her on our district website. She's our 504 coordinator. And then Deb Kraft, who we just recently heard from, as our director of counseling. In special education, it would be your special education teacher or your case manager. And you heard about that before. I believe that was Kristen Callisto who talked about that. It was, so you would be, that could be your SLP or someone like that, or your general education teacher if the question goes to general education. And then you would go directly to your building administrator, and then to a director of special education. So they're listed there. Kelly and Kristen work with our elementary schools, Melissa with our middle school and choice schools, Karen with our high schools, and then Carrie Lang with our health services. So those are who you can contact with respect to that. Next slide, please. We also wanted to make sure you were aware of some of the additional supports that are available out there. One of them was mentioned by Deb Kraft, which is our mental health and counseling hotline. It's available for support from 8 to 4 Monday through Friday, and it also has a voicemail there for non-emergency needs. You can leave a voicemail there if you want to have a more anonymous support that's not directly with your school counselor. If you want a second opinion from what you got from your school counselor, if anything that you would want to just kind of do related to mental health or counseling, we encourage you to call there. We also have a support for nursing that again is available from 9 to 12 Monday through Friday, and voicemail is also there. We can answer questions related to the COVID-19 crisis there. But also just any other general questions. We're starting to get questions about the fall with immunization requirements, with safety medications, etc. So that can answer questions, and those questions can be for you or a family member. We're happy to help. The same is true for the mental health and counseling hotline. Those don't have to just be about your child's needs, but your needs as well. We're happy to step in during this time to help support that. And then some essential resources hotline. If you have a technology question, childcare, nutrition services, rent assistance, power assistance, anything of that nature, we have a hotline for that as well. So we encourage you to be reaching out to those numbers if you need to, even if they don't have the direct response for you. There are people there who will know who to connect you to so you can get an answer for that. Next slide, please. We also partner with several mental health agencies. So if you're a family who during this time is experiencing more motivation needs, more supports around mental health, these are some of our partners who are taking calls right now. Happy to be supporting students in these areas. One more slide, please. Just to make sure that you all are aware too, we are providing meals. There's no, you do not need to be enrolled in Bellevue School District, and there are meals available for adults 19 and older for purchase, but free meals are available for any child 18 and younger. They can get breakfast and lunch. They can take them to go at those locations. You can also pre-order meals that are delivered to different locations. There's over 30 pickup locations, so you can take advantage of that. There's no paperwork or requirements to be done for that, so no need for that. And we also are continuing to provide childcare for emergency and essential workers. So if that's something that you need, there are some links and phone numbers there for you. Next slide, please. And then we wanted to make sure that you all knew about the Bellevue School District's commitment to having timely responses to your questions. And so while we have provided you sort of some information about who to go to first and what to do next, if you're not getting questions answered that are specific to your child's 504 or special education needs, and also some general information. We also have a space on our website in the COVID-19 resources for a place called Let's Talk, and you can see there are several buttons that discuss different types of supports or questions you might have, and there is one specific to special education. So if you have a question, we have special education staff ready to answer those, but if you have questions in any of those other areas, staff that are knowledgeable in those areas are on the receiving end of those emails that come through Let's Talk and allow us to respond to you. So we would encourage you, if you have questions that following the chat today, we'll be recording the questions in the chat, and those ones we weren't able to respond to today, we will be getting back to you on. But if you, when the chat closes today and you still have questions, we encourage you to use the Let's Talk function if it's not student specific in order to get your questions answered. So that's there for you. And I just wanted to say just a couple of things. We do I do appreciate the time that people have taken both during this time, during the chat, as well as prior to our forum to ask us questions. It really did help us to align our presentation today to the needs that you're experiencing out there. And we certainly recognized a level of frustration that's coming forward right now with respect to kind of the times that are going on right now, concerns about your children, concerns about what the fall will look like. And we apologize right now that we may not have all the answers, but we will be working to continue to get those answers. So following today, this presentation is being recorded, and we will be sharing it out with the same email list that we shared the invitation out with, along with the slide deck and other related resources. So you can have this to refer back to, as well as share out with others. We also will be creating additional resources that'll be based upon the questions in the chat and questions that we weren't able to get to today. And then for those questions that we don't yet have answers to, we will be providing another forum in August. And the August forum will be focused on what we can provide, what we will be providing based around the input that we got this spring on remote learning that will be happening this fall. So communication will continue throughout the summer, but as we approach the start of the school year, we will again address it through a community forum. So next slide, please. So I just want to take a moment to thank you for your grace during this unprecedented time, which I know we've used that phrase a lot, but I don't think any of us were really even at the beginning of this. You know, originally it was a 2-week, then it was a month, and then it was the rest of the school year. And it really was a very surprising turn of events for all of us. And to be asked to turn to remote learning in such a short amount of time. And while it has presented a lot of challenges, there's also been a lot of opportunities for growth and some spaces in the remote learning where kids have excelled. In addition to places where there's been challenges. And so I think one of the things we're really trying to do is capitalize on the things that we've learned during this time that have increased access for students through particularly technology. A lot of kids have actually been able to access things better in that environment, but also we're mourning the pieces that are more challenging to do in the remote environment, and in particular, the relationships that we have. So we just appreciate the grace that you've given us to be learning with you during this time, and knowing that we continue to see our need for growth and improvement. And we really do believe that we grow the most through some of the hardest things. And this has certainly been hard for you. It's been hard for us. We miss you, we miss our students. And so we just look forward to being able to connect with you in a continued fashion across the rest of this school year, over the summer, and in a more robust and hopefully face-to-face format in the fall. So with that, I'm going to close up the session for today. Look forward to chatting with you more in the spring, and be looking for the follow-up communication that will be coming up sometime next week. Thank you all.